Well, I mean, I honestly was just a kid, so I wanted my truck to do a big burnout, and it wouldn't do a big burnout. I wanted it to bark the tires when I went on the 1-2 shift, and it didn't do that. And then I was kind of irritated because I used their 93 tune, and I could audibly hear detonation. And as you know, I mean, if you audibly hear it, it's too late.
Welcome to the HPA Tune-In Podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by Matt Sanford of tuningtips.com. Matt has tuned all manner of vehicles, both gasoline and diesel. However, his main specialty and his main passion is for the LS GM market, specifically using the HP Tuners platform. And I know from my own experience that coming from an aftermarket standalone tuning world can be a little bit daunting learning how a factory ECU works, what the various tables are, how they relate to each other, and most importantly, I guess, which ones we actually need to adjust when we are tuning a GM vehicle. So we dive deep into the weeds in this episode with Matt. It's going to be perfect for those who want to learn more about the GM engine control module and how it works. We talk about the GM ECU logic flow. We talk about standalone versus factory ECU tuning, and when maybe converting from factory to a standalone might be the right solution. We also cover the way the GM ECU manages load measurement, specifically the way it uses both a mass airflow sensor as well as a speed density subsystem, and the process we need to go through to properly tune both. We also talk about ignition control. Obviously, ignition is the other key side of tuning after we've dealt with our fuel. We talk about how GM deal with this, specifically their high and low octane spark tables. We talk about how these work and how they relate to the not control strategy. One of the more common changes we'll make when we are adding, for example, forced induction to a factory naturally aspirated engine is adding a set of larger injectors, which is usually no big deal. But we learn why it's really important to select the correct injector for your application when you're tuning a GM factory engine control module, and specifically what data you're going to need to input to make your life super easy. Lastly, we also cover big cam tuning, and this is one of the areas I see even professional tuners consistently struggle with. It's honestly not that hard, and yes, you can get your big cammed LS running almost exactly like stock, albeit with a heap more power. Before we jump into our chat, for those who are new to the Tune-In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to build performance engines, how to tune EFI, how to construct wiring harnesses. We also cover topics on fabrication, 3D modeling and CAD, race driver education, and data logging, just to name a few. You can find all of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses. All of these courses are delivered in high definition video modules that you can watch from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection. This means you can learn from the comfort of your own place and you can learn at your own pace. All of our courses also come with a 60-day no questions asked money back guarantee. So if you purchase them for any reason at all, decide it wasn't quite what you expected, no problem, let us know. We'll give you a full refund. And for podcast listeners, you can also use the coupon code podcast75. That will get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. We'll put the coupon code in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you to find. Lastly, if you like free stuff, then I've got a great deal for you. We are constantly partnering with some of the biggest names in the aftermarket performance industry to give away some great prizes. You can always find our latest prize at hpacademy.com/giveaway. It might be an aftermarket ECU or dash. It could be some engine components or engine building tools, or just about anything in between. They are great prizes, and we will ship them free of charge to your door if you're the winner. There's no tricks here, no purchase required to get your name into the draw. All right, enough with our introduction. Let's get into our interview now. All right, welcome to the podcast, Matt. Thanks for joining us. And like always, let's find out a little bit about your background and specifically how you got an interest in cars.
Okay, well, I know a lot of guys nowadays will talk about that they, got their interest like late in high school when they, got to where they could drive. For whatever reason with me, I started at as early as I can remember. I remember being in daycare, looking outside, watching the cars going down the road, and I knew the make and model. It was one of those things where my mom, she may drive a minivan, but I would get irritated if she bought the minivan that had the smaller engine, like it's even 6-7 years old. I could tell if the van had a 3.8 V6 or if it had a 3.1 V6, or just kind of how I've always been. I don't really understand it.
Okay, so you're a very advanced toddler.
I suppose so.
All right, well, how'd that sort of develop? I imagine your mum was probably getting a little bit frustrated at you telling her what choice of minivan she should be buying.
Yeah, it honestly worked out pretty good because pretty much everybody around me had either raced motorcycles or they got into drag racing, or I was kind of just around automotive people. So it worked out good. I had, good places to vent, and yeah, I was able to actually use my knowledge even, early, 12, 13 years old. I'd help people work on cars. So
did any of this sort of interest or passion stem from maybe your dad, or is this completely outside of your family and just something you personally developed at kindergarten?
Yeah, so I didn't have the best childhood when it comes to the father figure. He did have a body shop when I was little, but he had left, by the time I was, I think, 7 or 8 years old. So I honestly, that's what I'm saying. I really don't know where it come from. I've never been able to understand it.
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting to kind of figure out where these influences came from. I mean, if I look at my own upbringing, my old man had an interest in cars, but I definitely wouldn't say he was super passionate about it. If anything, the rest of my family are all into motorcycles, and that's something I've absolutely never had a major interest in. So I guess there's no sort of definitive path that everyone has to sort of go down. It's a passion that can obviously just crop up. All right, so 12, 13, you're obviously starting to develop some mechanical skills. Sort of give us a little more insight into how that continued.
I honestly couldn't even tell you. It literally just continued to, as I got into high school, all my friends were driving cars. So I was always the younger kid of the bunch. Like I have a late birthday. So all of my friends would turn 16 when I had just turned 15. So I'd go over to their house and help them work on vehicles. But I was always, I grew up in kind of like the lowrider truck, like mini truck kind of era. So, I always had like a trucking magazine or something like that. But I never really had a good outlet for me to work on my own vehicles. So I just tried to, be around my friends whenever they're working on theirs.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's certainly cheaper than having to work on your own vehicle. You're kind of learning for free on someone else's dime. Where did the interest in the tuning side of working on cars come from, though? I mean, that's quite unique. Obviously, a lot of people interested in cars will learn how to spin spanners and do the basic jobs and maintenance tasks on their vehicles. But as I see it, and coming from my own experience, the EFI tuning side of things is quite unique, and it's a very different skill set.
It is. Again, it's just another one of those things where I'd read, the trucking magazines, or I'd watch, wake up in the morning, we had Power Block TV. So I'd watch Horsepower TV or just one of the national TV shows about cars. And I always noticed that they were buying these programmers and doing all this stuff where, they would have like this Super Chips flash pack. And I always just wondered how it worked. It was just something so simple that, when I got my first vehicle, I wanted to, buy a programmer. And then when the programmer didn't necessarily do what I wanted to do, I was trying to figure out, well, okay, how do I adjust this myself? And it just kind of snowballed into that.
Well, what was that first vehicle?
It was actually just something, it was just plain. It was a 2000 Dodge Ram, so a full-size pickup truck.
Okay. And you bought one of these off-the-shelf programmers, so essentially something that was going to flash a modified calibration into the factory ECU. You said it didn't quite do what you wanted, so explain that in a little more detail.
Well, I mean, I honestly was just a kid, so I wanted my truck to do a big burnout, and it wouldn't do a big burnout. I wanted it to bark the tires when I went on the 1-2 shift, and it didn't do that. And then I was kind of irritated because I used their 93 tune, and I could audibly hear detonation. And as you know, I mean, if you audibly hear it, it's too late.
It's no good. Yeah, I think that's one thing. We're going to dive into knock or detonation in this chat in a much more detail. But essentially, just what you mentioned there, when you can audibly hear it knocking, it's been occurring inaudibly from the driver's seat, probably, I don't know, maybe 2, 3, maybe even 4 degrees prior. And obviously, put a noisy exhaust on that and everything sort of goes out the window. So yeah, by the time you're actually hearing it from the driver's seat, it is safe to say this is absolutely no good.
Yes, sir.
I assume at this point your sort of passion for off-the-shelf tunes may have become a little bit questionable?
Yes, that was one of those things where, my friends would buy these aftermarket programmers, and after I would tell them my experience, then we all started to try to figure out, okay, how can we fix this? And so fortunately back then, we did have a little bit of an early era of being able to get in like the SCT Advantage software. So we'd start messing around with that. And then it just kind of snowballed into where I'm at today.
Okay, so you've just probably compacted a fair few years of tuning knowledge into a handful of words. So I want to kind of dig into that in a bit more detail. I mean, I'm coming from my own background here where I was self-taught with tuning just like you obviously are. And if you've got no resources to work from and you're really learning it all from scratch, it can be quite an uphill battle. And there is a lot to learn. And basically why High Performance Academy exists today is to provide the tuning resource that I would have loved to have access to when I was learning to tune. So yeah, on that basis, I want to hear a little bit more about your experience. Where were the sort of the pitfalls, the big wins? How long did it take you to become proficient? And obviously, you're talking initially about Dodge. You've now moved more primarily to the GM platform. So yeah, can you expand on that in a bit more detail for us?
Sure. Yeah. So initially, like I said, we got into the SCT Advantage software, and that was just one of those things where I was finding buttons to push, but I didn't know what the buttons did. So it was trial and error on my own vehicle. And fortunately, we had an 1/8 mile drag strip right down the street. So I could just go and drag race the truck and see if it pick up any numbers whatsoever. But the people that I would ask about this stuff, they would tell me, tuning advice from the sense of a carburetor, more timing, changing jets. So I had to basically in my head figure out, okay, what in the tuning software is the jet? What do I need to do on this distributor? Obviously you have the vacuum advance that can swing timing around. Where do I find that in this software? And I literally would just try to take the knowledge that I got from my carbureted friends and find it in the tuning software.
Okay, that for a relatively simple engine is definitely not bad advice. I mean, the engine essentially is just an air pump. We've just got two very different ways of providing fuel to it, and a lot more control of the specific ignition timing curve with EFI. So yeah, I get that. There is absolutely a correlation between jetting and our fuel delivery tables and the distributor, vacuum advance, and our ignition tables. But I mean, trying to assess the effect of these changes can be quite tricky without the benefit of a dyno. Now, you mentioned that you've got access to an 1/8 mile drag strip. So an interesting aspect with the drag strip that people who aren't into drag racing probably don't realize is that mile an hour number is actually telling you a lot about the performance of the engine. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we have to factor in density, altitude, and we have to factor in, other aspects of the engine, but absolutely mile an hour is the dyno. You cannot lie with mile an hour where you can on a dyno. So, back then we would watch the density, altitude, and then we would just see what the truck did. And then if the truck picked up numbers, okay, why did it pick up numbers? And if we figured out that it was from the DA change, then we knew, okay, maybe the tuning change wasn't valid. Let's just keep it on the same tune. Let's try again. And I mean, back then, again, we had nobody to ask. So we just did it until the truck went faster.
Okay, before we dive into the actual tuning changes, that term density, altitude, again, a lot of our listeners might not know what that means. Can you give us a bit more insight into that?
So the best way to look at it is your, I honestly don't know the best way to break it down. That would honestly be if somebody asked me, what is density, altitude, I would just tell them to Google it and watch videos from Gale Banks or somebody that,
right. Fair. I mean, it's a term that it's not necessary strictly to understand the specifics of it. Understanding how it's going to affect your tuning is what we need to understand. But to break that down for people, seeing as I sort of opened this can of worms, I mean, basically, the density of the air is going to depend on our altitude. Under standard conditions, we've got 101.3 kPa at sea level. However, depending on our weather conditions, that atmospheric pressure, even at sea level, is going to rise or drop, depending on whether we've got a high pressure or low pressure system. And then we've got a drag strip that's, let's say, at sea level, or maybe it's at 1,000 feet above sea level. Where our density altitude comes into account is we're actually looking at the atmospheric pressure and giving a density altitude what the engine thinks the altitude that it's operating is. So why that's important is if on a very low pressure day, the engine thinks that we're operating at, let's say, 5,000 feet above sea level instead of sea level, there's less oxygen available in the air. Therefore, the engine, all other things being equal, is going to make less power, but it's also going to affect our required fueling. Vice versa, we can actually have negative density altitudes where we've got very high pressure and effectively the engine's operating like it's below sea level, albeit probably not ingesting seawater. That's not going to work very well. Anyway, I think we've got the sort of gist of that. So basically what you're saying here is you're looking at the density altitude, understanding that as that varies, the performance of the engine is going to vary. So you're being quite scientific with this, because if the density altitude has changed dramatically between two runs, well, all bets are off in terms of the tune, correct? It could just be density altitude.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Okay, right. Now we've got that out of the way, let's forget about density altitude. When you were making your tuning changes at this point, what sort of magnitude of change were you making, let's say, to Spark?
So Spark, I was honestly swinging for the fence. I mean, you got to think I'm 16, 17 years old, so I've got these guys, they're basically chirping in my ear with their Fox body Mustangs where they're, going from 31 degrees of timing to 36 degrees of timing. And I'm thinking, okay, I know that, the cylinder head of this thing is not very efficient because it has the 360 Magnum engine. So they like some timing. I'm just going to go with what the Fox body guys say. And that wasn't a good choice either. So it's literally, we were just, swinging for the fence. And then, so I had to start to learn, okay, we've got to start doing this in small, better changes, using like a small hammer instead of a big sledgehammer. And so honestly, it come down to back then, our widebands weren't even very sophisticated. I had a odometer wideband that I'm pretty sure was just a narrow band with a wideband gauge on the screen, so we're just playing around with this stuff. I've got guys telling me to read the spark plugs. I had no idea. I was just pretty much, if somebody come up to me and gave me their opinion, all right, let's try it. And that's how we learned.
Yeah, a good place to get started, but particularly now these days with the likes of YouTube, you quickly find out that if you want to listen to everyone's opinion, you're going to drive yourself in circles going nuts really, really quickly. And the important part with opinions is that everyone's got one, but they're not all created equal, and definitely they're not all correct. So, I mean, a big part of this as well is the process of kind of sorting fact from fiction. And that's tricky, particularly when you don't know what you don't know. You're just getting started. So it's a case exactly like you were doing of applying some changes and then assessing the effect of those changes. It's a slow and potentially dangerous way in terms of the engine of learning, but it is a way of learning. Coming back to what you mentioned about the wideband, my experience mirrors yours. In the early days of my tuning experience, which, showing my age, I think might be a few years before you got started, there weren't the availability of quality wideband controllers that we've got on the market today. And you had kind of a couple of almost lab grade widebands, which at the time were in the sort of 5 to 10,000 USD vicinity. I mean, absolutely out the gate in terms of my budget. I definitely couldn't stretch to that. And to start with, I was using one of the old Bosch 4-wire sensors, and this was actually one that the early Motec systems used as their wideband. So it had a heater element, so you had 12 volts and ground to that, and then you were monitoring the output, which it was a 0 to 1 volt output, so narrowband output, and it was pretty hopeless. I quickly found as well that on the dyno or on a single pull on the road, you would get somewhat useful data from it, but you could also do repeated runs and it would overheat the sensor, and then the voltage output would drop off because it wasn't regulated, and again, all bets were off. So I mean, it was kind of like shooting fish in a barrel, not very accurate. Thankfully, the tuners coming through these days don't know how lucky they've got it with just such a wide range of super affordable wideband controllers, so that problem's sort of gone. Let's sort of talk about how you continued to develop. At what point did you start having access to a dyno to really advance your learning?
So I honestly didn't get access to a dyno until like 11 years ago. So I actually went from that Dodge, and I was seeing such small changes in the eighth mile time that I almost felt defeated. So I actually stopped tuning right then and there. I just decided, like, look, it's not worth it. I'd rather just work on a carbureted engine now. I got frustrated.
What was the limit there, though? Because, obviously, short of having forced induction where you've got the ability to actually turn the boost up and make a significant gain in power, with a naturally aspirated engine, once you've kind of got the tune in the ballpark, every engine's different, but the gains are going to be relatively minor, sort of starting to make hardware changes. So was this just a limitation of the engine as opposed to the tuning that you were seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. It was, 5,500 pound truck, 200 horsepower engine. It wasn't fun. But in my head, I thought that this laptop could do anything and everything, so I'm just wondering, like, I'm pushing these buttons. Why is the truck not going faster? And because you got to remember, 15, 16 years old, didn't really have anybody to ask other than these guys that didn't even know what a laptop was. So, but then my buddy started showing up with their programmers on their diesels. And that's when it started to set in with me is, okay, they're pushing their buttons and their truck's getting faster almost every single time. That's what I want to do. So then I jumped in the diesel side of things.
Okay. Well, that's a dramatic change. The tuning process for a diesel is almost the polar opposite of gasoline. Tell me about your experiences with those engines. How steep was that learning curve, taking what you'd now learned on a gas engine and trying to apply that to diesel?
Yeah, well, it come down to, I thought that timing number was just something that you turn up some more. I tried to transfer it over to the diesel side, and I torched a couple head gaskets doing it. So it's one of those things, but I finally got it to where, okay, I can add some fuel to this truck and the truck actually picks up power. Okay, I added some more. The truck's still picking up power. Then we start knocking out, pre and post injection, because this was in the later, like, starting to get into the common rail stuff. So then we start getting these, where we can make the engine sound different. And then we can make them lope, and we could do all those things. And it turned into, I guess I was kind of like the ricer side of the diesel. I wanted the lope tune, and I wanted the 12 valve rattly sound. And I was just doing that kind of stuff because my buttons that I pushed could do it.
Sure. One of the key differences with diesel versus gas, well, at least particularly if we're talking an OE calibration, is that when we're under wide open throttle with a gas engine, we're always tuning on the rich side of stoic, whereas with a diesel engine, we're always on the lean side of stoic. So quite different concepts. Very easy to make more power with a diesel by just throwing more fuel at it, which is why we often see drag applications billowing clouds of black smoke out the exhaust, unburned fuel. However, there's a limit to that because we get to a point where the combustion chamber temperatures become so hot that we start melting pistons and all sorts of ugly stuff that goes along with that. Did you find that limit?
We did. And that was the thing is whenever you're, country guy from Tennessee and you figured out how to make a truck black smoke, and, this is before the era of us actually really thinking about what we were doing to the environment. We were just pushing these buttons and we were melting stuff down. EGT was just a number to us. It was almost comical just to watch that odometer gauge at 2200 degree EGT just bury. And you're melting everything, and you're going through turbos, and you're losing exhaust manifold gaskets. But back then it was fun. I was a kid. So that's what we did.
Another stark difference between diesel and gas tuning with the turbocharged engines is boost with the diesel is really your friend, because it's all about adding more airflow into the engine. So by that, we're adding more oxygen, which then allows us to add more fuel without having an overly rich mixture. So quite dramatically different tuning styles, but I digress here. It's uncommon, at least in my experience, to find a tuner who's sort of gone from gas to diesel and then seemingly come back to gas. So fill in the gaps there.
So we started to get pretty big in the diesel tuning world. It got to the point to where we weren't just kids tuning diesels anymore. We were actually making money doing this.
And what age are we talking here?
We're talking 21, 22, 23 years old, getting really good at it. We figured out our niche. And obviously the pickup truck manufacturers here started to incorporate DPFs. And so it was one of those things where, nope, that thing's got to go. So we jumped right into that and we started making a ton of money and just having a blast. But our little 3-letter government agency decided to come after us. And so I was one of the few that got busted back in like 2011. That's when I thought, okay, well, if I can't tune diesels anymore, let's go back to gas and try it again.
Okay, that little 3-letter agency, which we'll leave unsaid, but I think probably everyone listening knows exactly who we're talking about. I mean, we're based here in New Zealand and we don't have the emissions compliance requirements that the US does. And obviously we are an internationally based company. We sell tuning courses all around the world. I'm going to preface this by, as we say inside of our courses, it's always the tuner's responsibility to make sure when they are making changes that they are staying true to the emissions requirements for their particular location. Now, this government agency has seemingly attacked a lot of tuning businesses in the US, although at least from what I've seen, they do seem to have primarily gone after that diesel market more than the gas market. Did you know why that's the case?
The black smoke. It was absolutely the black smoke. And it was us being kids, and that was the cool thing to do, And again, when you're young and dumb, you don't think about the consequences, and we got punished for it.
Can you give us a little insight into what those consequences looked like financially for you?
So I got a slap on the wrist, and I was basically told that I could not pick up another EFLI V2 ever in my life. And so I haven't.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of some massive, massive fines, but if you got a slap on the wrist, it sounds like you got off lightly.
Yeah, the threat was a $500,000 fine. And so several of my buddies actually just decided to go ahead on and they'll just wait for that fine to come to them and they continued tuning. But it scared me. I mean, I'm in my early 20s, just starting up a family. I can't have a $500,000 fine.
No, I mean that's gonna wipe out probably most small to mid-sized tuning shops. We're not sitting there printing cash. It's not that profitable. So yeah, I totally understand. All right, so at this point, you decide to switch back to gasoline a little bit more under the radar.
I did. So fortunately for me, because of the diesel tuning, I was able to afford some race cars. And so at that time, I was paying specific guys to tune the race cars. And I wasn't getting the results out of them. I mean, the car would stall after a burnout. It seemed like they weren't doing their job. But at that time, I understood EFI Live. So then I also had HP tuners, because that was right around the time where HP tuners was starting to support more of the Dodge Cummins and the Ford Power Strokes and things like that. So I had HP tuners there. I was like, I can figure this software out. So I started tuning my own race car. And then that car started running really well. And then my friends were like, well, hey, you're tuning your race car. Why don't you tune my race car? And it just snowballed into where we're at today.
All right. So what was the race car at that point that these other tuners were struggling with that you could sort out?
It was a 99 Pontiac Trans Am LS1 that was originally a manual transmission car. And so it had been swapped with a TH400. So we had no park neutral safety switch, no vehicle speed signal. So as you know, with the GM tuning, they really like those things when it's an automatic vehicle.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So there were a few idiosyncrasies with that particular vehicle that would have been a little bit more challenging than normal.
Yes, sir.
Okay. The EFI Live versus HP tuners sort of discussion in here. Obviously, you've just mentioned that you're already very familiar with EFI Live, and HP tuners sort of came into that same tuning market. These kind of end up being two of the main players in the market for reflashing software. Why did you move to HP tuners? I'm interested in that.
So honestly, it come down to I just like this software better. It looked better. The scanner seemed to function better. We didn't have to deal with, obviously with EFI Live, you have your scan and tune, you have V7, you have V8, you have all these pieces of software that you have to manipulate. And HP tuners just had the two. You had the editor and the scanner. And in my opinion, the scanner back then was so good for HP tuners when compared to the scanner in EFI Live that even sometimes I would tune a diesel truck with EFI Live and still data log it with HP tuners just because I like the way it looked. It just fit my tuning style better.
Okay. Totally fair. There's a couple of things I think we probably want to just take a step back here. And for those who are very new to retuning factory ECUs, I've just used the term reflash, and both of these software packages, as with a variety of others for different platforms, Cobb, EcuTech, the list is long. These are methods of recalibrating or retuning a factory engine control module, or ECU, whatever you like to call it. Typically, we do this by connecting to the ECU via the OBD2 port underneath the driver's steering wheel somewhere. We can read all of the calibration information out of the ECU, and then we can make changes to it and then flash or send those changes back into the ECU. So that's the general premise of reflashing. There's a couple of keys to this though. When we read all of that information out of the ECU, it's just a raw binary file that to us is going to make no sense. So we're relying on the software package to then find the particular maps or parameters that we need to be able to see, access, and then change. So a volumetric efficiency table, maybe a MAF calibration table, and also scale those so that the numbers make sense to us. An ignition timing number might be 20 degrees or something, as opposed to the raw number that comes out of ECU. So that's what we're relying on the software for. That allows us to see these tables, make changes to them in a way that makes sense to us as a tuner. And then we're also relying on this other piece of software, which is a scanner or a logger, because in most instances, we're not making these tuning changes live, and the factory ECU is quite complex. So we want to be able to scan or essentially log all of these parameters, what's occurring while the engine's running, so that we can then analyze that performance and decide what changes need to be made. Does that sound all like a reasonable sort of description of the process we're going through here?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Okay. On that basis, when we talk about the difference between EFI Live and HP tuners, these are just two software packages that are doing, in essence, the same job, showing us the same table. So it's not like EFI Live is necessarily showing us a table that doesn't exist in HP tuners. For the main part, we've all got access to them. They just look a little bit different. So a lot of this also comes down to personal preference, would you say? A key difference, though, with the EFI Live versus the HP tuners ecosystem, if you like, is the way that they go about business. So can you give us a rundown on what the HP tuners system incorporates, how it actually works? So what you as a tuner buy from HP tuners and how you use that to tune the vehicle?
Yeah, so HP tuners, you basically just go on their website and you pick up their interface, and that is their piece of hardware to actually connect from OBD2 port to your laptop or PC. And so they call it their MPVI. I honestly have no idea what it stands for, but I think we're on the current version is like an MPVI 3. So you purchase their interface and then you purchase credits. And credits is essentially your license to get into that ECU. So HP tuners themselves dictate how many credits based off of how much engineering time it took them to get into that ECM. So EFI Live kind of does the same thing, but they do it as a VIN license. So with EFI Live, you purchase a VIN license for that ECM. It's essentially the same price for all vehicles. And it just, to me, EFI Live did have a little bit better of a system back then. And I honestly haven't messed with EFI Live, like I said, since 2011 or so. So I'm not even sure where they're at nowadays. Is it still the same, like 125? Do you know?
It's a great question. I can't actually remember the last time I used EFI Live. By sort of accident, I guess. We have mainly based ourselves around the HP tuners ecosystem. That is simply what we get the most requests for. But we do have requests here and there for EFI Live. It just hasn't been the mainstream. But as I understand it, the EFI Live system, the dramatic difference is that you have what is quite an expensive hand controller or module that is then VIN locked to the individual vehicle. So as a tuner, you would sell that to your customer and that stays with the vehicle. So straight away, because you've got this actual physical piece of hardware that goes out with the vehicle, that system becomes quite a bit more expensive than, HP tuners. You're paying maybe 2 credits to license a particular vehicle. I can't actually remember off the top of my head what those credits cost, but significantly less than this module. There are advantages with the module-based system in that you can store multiple calibrations, and then the customer can switch from like a race gas cal to a pump gas, etc. So there's pros and cons with each system, but aside from that, you've obviously gravitated towards the HP tuners system. What are our options with HP tuners to get additional inputs into the vehicle? One of the key ones that I always want to have is a wideband, because unlike some of the late model European vehicles which run wideband lambda into the ECU, that's not always the case with GM. So yeah, what's the options there?
Well, so back in the day, what we could do is we could actually wire in our wideband, 0 to 5 volt wideband, and we'd wire it to the EGR pin on the ECU, and we would just basically use our scanner to process that signal, and we could get it to at least have our scanner show the wideband. But obviously there was no way for us to actually bring the signal into the ECU and have it use it for closed loop compensation.
No, of course. I mean, it's just passively for scanning. I mean, that original interface, which is years old now, and I guess maybe it was MPVI 1, I can't even remember. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but you had a green connector on the side of it which you could wire in additional inputs like a 0 to 5 volt wideband controller. I had nothing but trouble with that because they are so sensitive to ground offsets, and anyone who's followed this podcast for a while or us in general would know that I don't particularly like analog voltage-based wideband controllers. I'd much prefer a serial or CAN-based controller where we have a guarantee that the number is accurate. What's been your experience with that?
Well, okay. So back then it was the MPVI. It wasn't, at that time they hadn't put a number like nomenclature on it, but
I guess they never knew they were going to come out with a 2 and a 3.
Yeah. So they had the Pro version that had the green analog little side input, and then you had some that didn't. And that little green plug, I guess we'd call it, there's no telling how many I'd purchased of those. I didn't mind the analog input as much as I did just having to deal with all the wires.
That's a pain.
Oh, it was awful.
Yeah.
And you wear out the little screws and...
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's an exercise in frustration. I mean, just not to beat on about the ground offsets, but I mean, one of the key things there is I was using an Innovate LM2 inputting into that. And I mean, the key was to basically compare the number that you were seeing on the scanner versus the number you were seeing on your LM2 and just make sure that they were in fact the same. Otherwise your calibration was going to need tweaking. It's always really easy when you're seeing a number on your laptop screen to just go ahead and believe it, but ground offsets can make that a very dangerous game to play. Another good sanity check I always used to use is if the vehicle is running in closed loop mode at constant throttle, we should be seeing that wideband input into the scanner sit at or about 14.7 to 1. So I mean, if it's in closed loop and you're seeing 13.5, that should be a red flag for you.
Yeah, which if you as soon as you said the LM2, I know why you didn't like the MPVI Pro back then. That wideband never really interfaced really well with HP tuners.
Yeah, it was problematic.
Yeah, I tried it multiple times, and we ended up using the what did they call it back then? It was the NTK. I forget what it was called back then. It's now the Ballinger AFR 500, but it was the NTK version of it from back in the day.
I remember that one, although I also forget the name of it. One thing with that LM2 was that it did have a serial interface for the scanner, and if I could have back the hours that I spent bashing my head against the wall trying to get that to work, I'd be a very happy man. And I mean, it did work sporadically, but you'd do the same thing 10 times in a row, and 1 out of those 10 times you'd get your wideband number pop up and it was game on. Everything was happy days. And then
it was just like kind of like the Nintendo games from back in the day where the guys would blow in the game, and all of a sudden the game would work. That's how that LM2 was. You'd unplug that little serial plug and blow into it and put it in there and hold your toes a certain way and then maybe it would work. Yeah, I get it for sure.
Yeah, you definitely don't want the sun shining in your eyes while you're doing it. So it's just very, very sensitive. Moving on, I actually found what I gravitated towards was the AEM X Series CAN-based wideband controller. I mean, there's dozens of these on the market. That's just one that I found worked pretty well. And that with the later MPVI2, we would just have a CAN pass-through connector for the OBD2 port, and that would then transmit the wideband data as a CAN message. And again, that was very easy for the scanner to then decipher. Again, you had a guaranteed rock-solid wideband, and that I found rock solid. I don't know if you've tried any of those CAN-based controllers.
I've used it today.
Okay, perfect. All right, I think we dive down a bit of a rabbit hole on that, but let's move on and let's focus a little bit around the GM. I mean, again, as I mentioned, you're not strictly limiting yourself to GM, but this does seem to be your main area of expertise. So let's dive into the GM ECM world in a bit of detail and see what we can uncover. So in terms of logic flow, it's really important when we are coming into the factory ECU tuning world of actually understanding how the ECU operates. So this is going to define for us what sort of tables we're going to have access to and how we're going to approach the tuning. And actually, before we dive too far into this, come back one step and we'll talk about standalone tuning versus factory ECU tuning. Am I safe in assuming that you've had your share of experience on aftermarket standalones as well?
I have, yes, sir.
Perfect. All right, so what do you find are the key differences in your tuning approach between a standalone and a factory engine control module?
Well, what's kind of funny is as a person that has tuned factory control modules for the majority of their tuning career, I almost struggle with standalones because I can tell it the truth. Being able to actually input in the correct injector data and being able to actually have boost control and, seeing ignition timing maps based off of manifold air pressure that's above, 100 kPa. I love it, but it actually took me a while to wrap my head around.
Okay. What is it, do you think, that makes it tricky for tuners that have maybe grown up and learned on an aftermarket standalone to transition to tuning factory engine control modules?
I honestly think it comes down to developing that initial calibration. As somebody that deals with factory ECU, you've got a really, really good calibration to start with. So a lot of your, startup and things like that, it's GM or whatever the manufacturer is, it kind of already worked that out. Whereas with the standalone stuff, I mean, you're kind of on your own with those. You've got to have either a base calibration or just have a really good general idea of how an engine works to be able to get a standalone to start up.
Yeah, I think where a lot of tuners actually have it around the wrong way is they think that tuning a standalone is quicker and easier. And the reality of that is if you're approaching a tuning job with a freshly installed ECU with no base map, and I'm talking standalone here, you've got a lot of work to do. Not only do you have to develop your fuel table, VE table, however the ECU actually operates, as well as your ignition table. So that's the meat and potatoes of your tuning work. But on top of that, you've got idle speed control, you've got cold start, you've got transient enrichment. The other aspect with this is that a lot of those other tables that I just mentioned, those can't be properly optimized until our main fuel and ignition are calibrated, at which point the engine is obviously hot. So then we need to let the engine cool down and check our cold start the next day. And then if we're operating in the middle of summer, well, that's not going to be true when we now get to the middle of winter where the ambient temperature might be 20 or 30 degrees lower. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. Whereas in the factory tuning world, particularly if we've got a factory engine with some basic bolt-ons, let's say we've put some headers and an exhaust system on, maybe a freer flowing intake, but the engine is mechanically stock. I find that our tuning requirements are actually relatively minor. The base calibration is probably still, for the most part, going to hold true. Maybe we're going to need to do some work with our MAF and speed density calibrations. Our ignition timing almost certainly is going to require some improvement or modifications, but a lot of that work can be almost exclusively focused on the wide open throttle tuning area. And if we get all of that calibration right, our cold start, our idle, our transient enrichment, at least in my experience, are going to need little, if any, work. Does that hold true with your experience as well?
Absolutely. Honestly, I would take tuning a bolt-on factory ECU car all day, every day, compared to doing a raw startup file for a standalone ECU.
Yeah. Now, with my own experience when I was running my tuning shop, we focused a lot on the GM product in the later years because we found that having staged packages of upgrades for a very narrow focus of vehicles was a much more efficient way of us running a tuning shop. We could make more money. We had happy customers. We could tell them within 3 or 4 horsepower what their vehicle was going to make, and there was no guesswork in terms of the package is going to cost this. And that's just what it was. And often, particularly until we got to the point of a big cam upgrade, it took longer to bolt the car on and off the dyno than it did to actually perform the tune. I mean, obviously we had a base file library for these vehicles, so we weren't exactly starting from scratch. But I mean, generally 5 to 6 pulls on the dyno and you were probably done. Now, granted, you start putting a cam or a supercharger or turbos, that goes out the window. There's a lot more work, but I'm just talking these base files. So just basically trying to get to the point here that tuning these factory ECUs is not scary. It's actually very, very easy once you understand the process and the tables you're going to need to adjust. And I think where a lot of tuners get put off is when you open HP Tuners or EFI Live and we just look at all of these tabs of these parameters and tables, it can be overwhelming. But again, for these basic bolt-on calibrations, we can focus our work on a handful of tables, maybe 5 or 6. Does that sound about right to you?
Yes, sir. And that's when it's done correctly. Now, a lot of tuners that I run across, they almost feel like they get paid off of how many changes that they make. And so they'll go in and they'll just change anything and everything that they can. But absolutely, for what you're talking about, MAF calibration, a little bit of ignition timing, maybe some power enrichment changes, just some basic stuff, and you're good to go.
Yeah, correct. All right. The other obvious question that comes out of this, as a factory ECU tuning guy, do you kind of have a line in the sand or a point at which you feel it makes more sense to switch to standalone? Now, I'll preface this with, obviously, with the later model vehicles where there's a lot more CAN integration, a lot more complexity in the communication between ECM, TCM, gauge cluster, all of the rest of the complex systems. In those instances, it can be difficult or even impossible to switch to a standalone. But let's talk stripped out race car that's very basic where we could have the option of either. Is there a line in the sand where you feel standalone makes more sense?
To me, it comes down to if you've done a transmission swap, if you're using a Power Glide, Turbo 400, something like that, a non-electronic automatic, I would absolutely go to standalone at that point. If you want to run an aftermarket drive-by cable throttle body with a really big camshaft, I would go to a standalone at that point. There's just some stuff that is so far off from factory engineering that a factory ECU isn't happy that way.
I think it's also a case of, just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should. I mean, probably there'll be people listening that would argue those examples you just gave can be run on a factory ECM and, is the juice worth the squeeze, I think is probably the point of considering, when it's right to switch. All right, let's get back into this GM logic flow. So as with a lot of late model factory engines, we'll see in the GM LS world a mass airflow sensor fitted. So predominantly the mass airflow sensor is the main load input that the ECU is relying on in order to schedule correct delivery of fuel and correct delivery of ignition timing. But a lot of people, again, fresh to the GM tuning world, kind of overlook the fact that there is also a speed density subsystem in these controllers. Can you talk to us about what speed density is and how this system integrates in the GM world?
Yeah, so GM speed density, obviously it depends on which generation of ECU we're talking about. But in the earlier Gen 3 ECU, so say, 99 to 2002 LS1, it's going to have a VE table that it's not, they call it volumetric efficiency. It's really not the true volumetric efficiency, as most factory ECUs don't comprehend volumetric efficiency the way it actually is scientifically, but it is essentially a number giving us a percentage of how to convert airflow to injector pulse width. And so the GM ECU, like with the Gen 3 car, like I said, an LS1, the car even starts off with volumetric efficiency. It doesn't transfer over to MAF until after cranking fuel has already been handled. Then at that point, it goes straight over to MAF. And MAF is your just ultimate input. Like you said, it's the weather station. It's everything.
And the nice thing for those who kind of haven't delved too deep into this, the nice thing with a mass airflow sensor, and we're assuming here properly calibrated, which we'll get into in a moment, is that it is reporting to the ECM the mass of air entering the engine. And that's the key element that the ECU needs to know, because if it's targeting a specific air-fuel ratio, well, that is a mass ratio. It's looking at the ratio of the mass of air entering the cylinder to the mass of fuel that it's being delivered. There's a whole nother set of tables, which again we'll probably dive into, that define the injector scaling or calibration. In other words, for a given pulse width, what mass of fuel is being delivered. So assuming that that side of the tuning equation is all on point, it's very easy for the ECM to decide for a given mass of air, what pulse width do I need to send to the injectors? And if that all works correctly, we are just going to get the correct air-fuel ratio. And obviously, in order to meet emissions compliance as well as everything else they're trying to do, that's really, really important to the OE manufacturer. So at what point does this controller switch between MAF, which, as we've talked about, that's the main input, to the speed density subsystem? You've talked about startup. What other situations will it use speed density?
Well, so it honestly, it comes down to the calibration itself. But in a stock LS1, and your experience may be a little bit different than mine, but I actually see them going MAF only, essentially start to finish. There are some times during transient conditions where they'll use speed density, and it honestly comes down to there is a handful of tables that you can adjust to where you can actually set the high-low range, where it's utilizing VE versus MAF. But in a factory calibration form, it is essentially MAF only after startup and during transient.
Yeah, I think that does essentially match mine. It is predominantly the mass airflow sensor. We do see on transient, so sharp throttle inputs, and I think this really comes down to the fact that can be on a sharp transient input, there can be a latency in the mass airflow sensor signal reaching the ECM. Whereas speed density is based on manifold absolute pressure. So the MAP sensor physically fitted to the intake manifold, that's going to respond more sharply, more quickly than the MAF. So yeah, as I understand it at least, it'll switch momentarily to speed density for that transient. And then once essentially we're back to equilibrium or steady state conditions, it'll switch back to the mass airflow sensor. Now, the problem that I kind of see this bringing about for tuners who really don't understand that speed density subsystem is there in the first place and how it responds is I see a lot of tuners who ignore it completely, and they'll go and modify the mass airflow sensor calibration and get everything tracking nicely. And again, if you're talking about a basic car where there's no modifications or maybe some bolt-ons, that can do. You might bring in some weird drivability things on a transient that maybe might even not be noticeable, but when you start making more dramatic changes to the engine configuration, I'm talking here, heads, cam, particularly a cam, we're moving further and further away from that base speed density or VE table being accurate to the actual VE of the engine. And if the tuners don't then tune that, can bring in some more weird drivability issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Like what you basically described is what separates the men from the boys when it comes to tuning. The guys that will skip the speed density side of things, they will just let it go. They'll just, whatever, this is how a cammed vehicle is supposed to drive is what they'll tell their customers. This is how it's supposed to start. This is a 500 horsepower engine. You're going to have to just expect some drivability issues is what they'll tell their customers. And I don't appreciate that whatsoever.
Yeah, I could not agree more. That sort of stuff, to me, it's pure laziness, probably coupled with a lack of knowledge in the first place. But the number of cars that I retune, and I'm not just talking here GM, but just retune cars that were moderately through to heavily modified, and you'd start the car and it'd stall. You couldn't get it to take off from a standing start without basically revving it up and dumping the clutch, and then just generally the drivability was absolute dog shit. And customers all around the world have this ingrained that, well, it's a modified engine, that's how it should be. But the truth is you could, for the most part, get even a very heavily modified engine driving almost like stock. I mean, obviously, big cams, yes, there are some exceptions there, but I mean, it just is laziness. So What are the solutions? How should we be going about the tuning process on one of these vehicles? Let's stick to Gen 3 for the moment.
Well, so Gen 3, there's a couple different routes to go. The simplest way would be to calibrate your MAF and then obviously fail the MAF and then go into speed density tuning. Now, I don't do that. I base all of my speed density calculations off of the MAF and actually tune them simultaneously. But that is just from years of experience of messing with these cars and learning the right buttons to push to find that. But if I was teaching somebody to start from scratch, it would be to dial in the MAF, then fail it, and then tune speed density, or vice versa. Honestly, it's a little bit easier. Technically, it's a little bit easier to do speed density first, because if you get speed density first done, while you're data logging speed density in, we'll call it one of your final renditions of your VE table, you can actually data log dynamic airflow versus your mass airflow sensor frequency and essentially build your mass airflow sensor table while you're driving. And so that was also another good route to go.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think what I've tended to do in terms of the order that we teach is just to make it simple so that while we're learning, we only have to focus on one task at a time. So I go down that path of what you first mentioned, basically get the MAF sensor calibrated first and then fail it. And when we say fail it, basically we're telling the ECM that the output from it's not reliable and it'll go into a fault mode where it then relies solely on speed density. Then we can go calibrate the speed density. So again, we're only focusing on one narrow slice of the tune at a time. And then once we've got both of those, we can bring the MAF back into the equation and everything should work out. Now, another lazy approach that I have seen is basically disabling the dynamic airflow completely. So essentially, the ECM is forced to only rely on MAF. Your opinion on that? Is this a viable technique?
Well, so here's the thing is, if you data log it and you focus on transient fueling, even if you make that high RPM enable number 100 RPM or 400 RPM, it's still going to rely on speed density in some aspect of it. And I have not found a way to go fully MAF, which I don't care because obviously I'm going to try to tune it how GM does it. But I don't know if there's even a way to truly go MAF only. And that's where the laziness is getting people in trouble.
All right, so we've talked about the Gen 3 model. As we moved into later vehicles, Gen 4 and Gen 5, things got a little bit more complicated. So if we go into Gen 3, as you already mentioned, there is a physical volumetric efficiency table. We can see it's a three-dimensional table, RPM versus manifold absolute pressure, VE numbers that, as you mentioned, may or may not be particularly accurate. But, we've got numbers that, if we understand VE, kind of make sense, maybe in the 95% vicinity at, wide open throttle peak torque. So, kind of makes sense. When we go to Gen 4 onwards, that's kind of off the table. Now there is no physical VE table that we can see. Instead, it's sort of a bunch of coefficients for a complicated quadratic equation, and maths was never my strong point. First of all, why? What have GM done here? Why did they go this route?
The only thing that I can think of is that they did it to speed up ECU processing, because it doesn't have to formulate a percentage. It is literally just looking at raw data. And correct me if I'm wrong, I have no idea, but that is my thought process behind it, is they did it to speed it up.
As I understand it, I think it's more to do with future-proofing for more complex engines, in that if we look at volumetric efficiency, like the LS ones are pretty basic workhorses, not a lot of tech going on here. So if we look at a given combination of RPM and manifold absolute pressure, the VE is the VE. That ain't changing. Now, if we look at a more complex engine that's maybe starting to bring in continuously variable cam timing, and that's not to say all LSs have this, but it's a generation of a controller that can allow for this. Now we look at a manifold absolute pressure of X and an RPM of Y, but now our volumetric efficiency is also going to depend on our cam phasing, our cam angle, and that could be continuously variable. So then by focusing on these quadratic equations, it can calculate the VE based on this. So it makes things more complicated, but when we're starting to get, particularly if we looked at more complex engines with continuously variable, like overhead cam, continuously variable intake and exhaust, there's such a massive range of potential that it's difficult to do or impossible to do with one table. So I understand that's why GM brought in this virtual volumetric efficiency. But once we're sort of beyond the fact that now we don't have our VE table that's nice and easy to view inside of the tables or parameters, the actual way that the ECU works is the same?
Yeah, absolutely. It's still primarily MAF based. Obviously, it has the virtual volumetric efficiency that it looks at in the background. There is some major differences in transient fueling. I mean, there's a pretty drastic change going from Gen 3 to Gen 4, but it still has the same principles behind it.
Sure. One nice thing that HP tuners did do, because essentially when the Gen 4 first came out with this virtual VE, and again, all we've got that we can visually see inside of the parameters is these coefficients for this equation, which, I mean, make no sense to us. So tuners were using sort of third-party tools like Blue Cat to then turn those quadratic equations into an actual VE table that we can recognize and make sense of, albeit the numbers were somewhat different. We'll get into that in a second. Then HP tuners actually kind of saw the light, and they incorporated this now inside of the VCM editor, correct?
Yes, sir. Yeah, I had to use the Blue Cat tool for a very long time. I was very thankful that HP tuners brought out that calculator up top.
Yeah, it's very nice to have that all built in. All right, so can you give us a kind of a rundown on how that built-in tool works for seeing and, more importantly, then making changes to the virtual volumetric efficiency subsystem?
Yeah, so what's nice about that tool is when you open it up, it is essentially you're making the same changes just like your old GM, Gen 3 V table. You can actually, higher numbers is more fuel, lower numbers is less fuel. It made it very simple. Now, you have to focus on cam position. You can actually scale your RPM axis. You can scale your map axis or your P ratio axis, depending on which ECU you're working with. It actually makes it really easy. And they gave us the heat mapping features, just kind of like what we have on standalones, where we can actually see, red is rich and, green is lean. And yeah.
One of the obvious differences, though, from Gen 3 to Gen 4, when we look at this virtual VE table, is the actual size of the numbers in it. I mean, again, Gen 3, as I mentioned, we're seeing numbers that kind of make sense as a VE number, sort of maybe in the range of 80 to 100, 110% or whatever that might be. We've got numbers in the thousands in terms of Gen 4 onwards. So what is this number? What does it mean? Do we care?
I mean, honestly, so back in the day, we called it GMVE, and that was just something that we had come up with on the forums. It just made sense. But, when it comes down to what the numbers are, it is literally a very long calculation of, injector pulse width, manifold air temp. It's a pretty involved little equation.
I think the key to it, though, is the actual magnitude of that number really doesn't matter. All we need to understand is if we add 10% to it, we're going to get essentially 10%, or we're telling the ECU we've got 10% more airflow, so the ECU is going to respond in terms of its fueling output. So really, the magnitude of the numbers between Gen 3 and Gen 4 don't matter. The way it responds to changes is still the same.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just going to interrupt our chat with Matt here and talk about a package of courses that I know you're going to love if you've enjoyed this deep dive into LS tuning with Matt. And that is our tuning starter package, normally valued at $417 US. We've got a super special deal for you. You can use the coupon code MAT100. That'll get you $100 off, bringing it down to just $317 US. This package of courses starts with our EFI Tuning Fundamentals course, which teaches you the core tuning principles and techniques that you need to know and understand, irrespective of what type of engine you're tuning. You'll learn how the engine responds to fuel and ignition and what we need to do to optimize both of those parameters. We then move into our practical tuning course. You've actually got the choice here of our practical standalone tuning course, perfect for those of you who want to learn how to tune an aftermarket standalone ECU, or relevant to this particular episode with Matt, we've got our practical reflash tuning course, which teaches you how to reflash a factory ECU. Now, to be clear, clear, these courses are both generic, so it doesn't matter what specific ECU, engine, or tuning platform you're working with, these courses will have you covered. I'll dive into the Reflash course just a little bit. You'll learn how the factory engine control module actually operates and what we need to do when we're making tuning changes. You'll learn how to correctly calibrate the mass airflow sensor calibration table. You'll learn how to adjust your calibration for a larger set of injectors and more. I know that when it comes to reflashing your first vehicle, it still can be a bit daunting. So what we've done within this course is broken the entire tuning process down into the HPA 6-step process. By doing this, each of the individual steps is relatively quick and easy to complete, and in no time you'll have a completely tuned engine that's delivering great power, great torque, and most importantly, great reliability. Also, by covering the 6-step process and moving through each of the steps one after the other, it'll make sure that you don't overlook any critical steps that could waste time, waste money, or potentially even damage your engine. Now, that's the body of the course. After you've gone through this, we move into our library of worked examples, and this is an informal walkthrough of that 6-step process where you can watch it being applied to a range of different vehicles with a range of different reflashing platforms. Importantly, and relevant to our chat with Matt, there's a range of GM reflashing worked examples there, right up to and including one with a aggressive large cam. Remember, I said that's one of the areas a lot of people really struggle with. Moving on, we're also including our Understanding Air-Fuel Ratio course, and this, in my opinion, is probably one of the most misunderstood topics in the world of EFI tuning. We'll teach you how the engine responds to air-fuel ratios. We'll give you some safe starting air-fuel ratios for a range of different engines so you can get up and running with no risk of damaging your engine. And then most importantly, we'll show you how to test and find the optimal air-fuel ratio for your engine and application. This package also comes with 24 months of access to our Gold membership. This includes our live weekly webinars. You can also review our webinars in our archive where we've got over 350 hours of existing content, and you'll get access to our members only private forum, which is the best place to get reliable, trustworthy answers to your specific tuning questions. So remember, that package is normally $417 US. Using that coupon code brings it down to just $317 US. We still have some options at checkout to break that down into as many as 8 individual weekly payments, just to make it as affordable as we can. Importantly, you are also still protected with our 60-day no questions asked money back guarantee. So if you purchase and for any reason at all decide the course just wasn't what you expected or is not right for you, let us know and you'll get a full refund of the purchase price. Let's get back to our interview now. All right, which brings us to the approach to actually optimizing these two elements of the ECU, the mass airflow scaling or calibration, and then the speed density subsystem. And this relies heavily on using our scanner. Can you give us a bit of insight into your approach? Let's start with the MAF calibration. How would you generally go about that?
So MAF calibration, it kind of depends on where you're taking your data at. Are you on a dyno? Are you on the street? Are you tuning in open loop? Are you tuning in closed loop? So if you're, tuning in closed loop, you can obviously do your MAF calibration versus fuel trims. You just develop in the scanner, you go to your graphs, we used to call them histograms, and you would just tell it the parameter that you're going to data log is going to be your mass airflow sensor frequency. You would copy your row from your tune file, whatever your frequency is. Traditionally, there's 0 to 15,000 hertz, and you would just copy that over into the scanner, and then you would just have the scanner, the actual parameter that you're inputting into the graph would be whatever fuel trim, if you're looking at long term, if you're looking at short term, or if you're looking at EQ error. Just kind of depends on your environment.
Okay, so a bunch of terms you've just brought in here, and this admittedly is a little bit tricky in an audio-only format. It's always really nice to be able to show these things physically, and at the end of this, we'll talk about your YouTube channel. People can jump on there. We've also got a couple of videos we might link to on our own channel that kind of go into a little bit more detail, but the histogram function in the HP Tuner's VCM scanner, that's really a super powerful tuning tool for gathering and analyzing large quantities of data, which is really important in order to find sort of the averages of what we're actually seeing. So what you're talking about here is developing a histogram that essentially replicates the breakpoints of the MAF calibration table. So we've got the same frequency breakpoints as the MAF calibration table in the editor. And that's super easy to do. We can just copy the labels from the table and paste those into our histogram, and that's all the hard work done for us. But why that's important is that then when we've got an error in the MAF calibration at, let's say, 3000 hertz or whatever it might be, we can then paste that error from our histogram, and we can use a special paste function and actually paste that error or correction straight into the VCM editor. So super powerful way of making large scale across the board changes. Now, we might not always want to do that. We might start like that and then start fine tuning by hand, but very, very powerful. You also use the term there, field trims, which we can use, as you said, in closed loop. So let's talk about closed loop. Under those conditions, the ECM is going to be targeting lambda 1, 14.7 to 1. And then it relies on the short-term and long-term field trims to kind of pick up the pieces if it's not right on its target. So by then filling the histogram with the combination of short-term and long-term field trims, we're going to be able to see whether we're too rich and the ECU is pulling fuel, so negative trims, or conversely, the ECM is adding fuel with positive trims because we're too lean, and we can sort of get a sense of what needs to be done to the calibration. The other term you used is EQ error. So without going too deep here, the GM engine control module actually uses equivalence ratio, not lambda. Not really that critical. It's simply the inverse of lambda. So if we have, lambda 0.85, if we want to convert that into equivalence ratio, we just put that into our calculator, use the inverse or 1 over function. That'll give us the equivalence ratio, which is what we'll see in those tables. But essentially, EQ error, equivalence ratio error, we're looking at the error between the measured lambda and the target or commanded lambda, and generally that comes from our wideband input, which we talked about before. One of the things we need to be careful of is we're looking at equivalence ratio error, which is my preference. It's also really important to put the ECU into open loop mode, because otherwise, particularly under the closed loop area of operation, it's going to have these short-term and long-term field trims working in the background. And if everything's working correctly, our equivalence ratio error should be very, very close to 0. But if we actually look at the trims, we could still have combined trims of plus or minus maybe 15 or 20%. Does that sort of follow your experience as well?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
What is the limitation of simply running in closed loop and using the short-term and long-term field trims? Is that a viable way of tuning the entire mass airflow sensor calibration?
No. So obviously, once you are ready to use the power of the engine, you're going to go into power enrichment, and power enrichment goes into open loop. So your short-term and long-term field trims are not going to give you any type of feedback once you're in open loop. So traditionally, you're good. If you're going to tune in closed loop using the narrow bands, you're good up to whatever your TPS threshold that you've got set in your power enrichment table.
Okay, so in essence, at some point, particularly tune that power enrichment or wide open throttle area of operation, which is also the most critical for engine performance and reliability, we're going to need a wideband anyway?
Yes, sir.
So if we've got the wideband in there, this sort of begs the question, does the combined short-term and long-term field trim style of MAF calibration make sense for the closed loop area, or would you just set the ECM into open loop across the board and solely rely on that EQ error?
To me, that's going to be more of tuner's discretion.
Yeah, okay, fair.
I personally like to use a dyno and, do steady state MAF tuning in open loop and then fine tune with short-term field trims after the fact. But for the general public, when it comes to tuning, I absolutely do believe that they should be able to use closed loop function to tune the MAF calibration and the speed density side of things, as long as they know that their vehicle is mechanically sound, i.e., no vacuum leaks, functioning oxygen sensors, the car is mechanically sound. I do think that closed loop function should be able to be used for tuning up to that point of going into power enrichment.
I absolutely agree. And I think the other aspect with that as well is, because the wideband generally is going to be a temporary addition while we're tuning, once you've got that power enrichment area of the operation dialed in to your satisfaction and you're hitting your commanded air fuel ratio targets, obviously the wideband at some point is going to come off the vehicle. Out on the street, maybe if the vehicle comes back for a quick checkup or a touch-up, you can get a pretty good health check or sanity check on the state of tune by looking at the combination of short-term and long-term fuel trims under cruise, which then comes to the question of what is acceptable in terms of a short-term and long-term fuel trim combination. What are you sort of aiming for where you sort of say to yourself, yep, I've nailed it, this is on point?
So I am pretty OCD about this stuff. So first and foremost, I'm not sure how you feel about this, but I don't like using long-term fuel trims whatsoever. I feel like for the end user, it leaves too much on a modified vehicle. It leaves too much room for error on their part to where, say I tune a vehicle and I leave long-term fuel trims on. If they have exhaust manifold bolts that break, if they have, a misfire that comes up, the vehicle learns those fuel trims, which, on the plus side, the ECU can throw a code and say system too lean or system too rich. But I'll have customers to where they'll call me saying that their tune has gone bad and they just don't want to believe they have a mechanical issue. So I tune short-term fuel trim only and leave it just like that. And that's just my style though. What's your thoughts on it?
That's absolutely my preference as well. And again, I show that through the course. I do discuss that this is kind of personal preference. There's no, this is the way you must do it. And personal preference does become a big aspect of OE tuning, I think. Well, actually, any tuning for that matter. From memory, one of the problems with the long-term fuel trims is that those do stay active under power enrichment from memory as well. Can you tell me if I'm off the mark there?
No, they do. They very much function in open loop. So to me, to actually be able to, on the street or in our environment and the amount of time that we have to tune, to be able to get long-term fuel trims as close as what the OE could do to where they're still accurate through power enrichment, to me it doesn't make sense for us to do that, because there's no way for us to get that level of calibration when compared to the manufacturer's environment. They're on a chassis dyno, they can control temperature, they can control everything. We can't. So to me, but I do, when it comes down to fuel trims, I tell everybody be okay with plus or minus 10%. Traditionally, I'll actually even get plus or minus 2 or 3%, sometimes even tighter than that. I'm pretty picky.
I think my experience and targets kind of match yours. Plus or minus 10%, if I saw that, I'd be, it's in the ballpark. That ballpark's a little wide, but it's in the ballpark. Personally, I'm sort of aiming for the plus or minus 2 to 3% as well. Plus or minus 5%, I'm probably going to be pretty happy with. I think the trick here is like not beating yourself up to try and get that sitting at 0, because it's simply not realistic. You'll get it to 0. Well, I mean, it's never 0. Plus or minus 1% maybe one day, but something changes. The conditions change, the temperature changes, and all of a sudden, with no changes to calibration, that 0% is going to go to plus or minus 2 or 3%. So I think understanding that this is a moving target and kind of seeing as well what the OEs actually felt was acceptable in terms of trims with a completely 100% stock vehicle, that's just as important. Otherwise, you're going to send yourself crazy trying to achieve something that's just physically not possible, and ultimately for no real benefit as well. So I think that's important to kind of understand the levels to this. Before we move on, just mentioning those histograms as well. We talked about the MAF calibration, but importantly, we can also set up another histogram that, of course, matches our speed density or VE table and do exactly the same with that. So this time, obviously, we've got manifold absolute pressure on one axis. We've got RPM on the other axis. Again, we can bring those labels in from our actual VE table if we're talking Gen 3, or our virtual VE table if we're talking Gen 4 onwards, and again, make it nice and easy to apply those changes. So the point of this is it's actually really, really quick and easy with the histograms to gather all of this data and then make, I would probably say MAF calibration 2, maybe 4 iterations of changes. You should have that dialed in. Do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. We're speaking the same language, which is always helpful. Okay, so once we've got our MAF calibration, our speed density calibration dialed in, we do also have our ignition timing to consider, which is obviously the other core element. Fuel and ignition, always our two big sides of this. And this is one area, again, where I think people coming from the aftermarket standalone world will take a little bit of time to adapt. Obviously, traditionally in an aftermarket standalone, we're not using a massive flow sensor, and our ignition table is going to be a three-dimensional table with RPM versus manifold absolute pressure. In the GM world, we've got a somewhat unusual load axis, which is listed as spark air mass, and that's grams per cylinder. What's that mean?
Well, I mean, essentially that is, we're basically just measuring air load per cylinder volume. And I prefer cylinder air mass to be on the axis for the standalones. We need these standalone manufacturers to implement that. I've actually told Holly multiple times we need to be able to put still air as the axis for their spark tables.
If you actually understand what is going on in terms of the engine's requirements for ignition timing for a given operating condition, this actually makes perfect sense, because it is the spark, it is the air mass in the cylinder that's going to be the defining element in terms of the ignition timing for a given RPM. So it does make sense, but again, it takes a little bit of time to wrap your head around. And I think one of the tricks to this, I guess, is if you're coming into HP tuners for the first time, at least as far as I recall, the stock histograms that they give you do not give you an ignition timing table with spark air mass as a load axis. It's manifold absolute pressure. And that's one of the problems I find, is because, again, for those who are new to this, it's very difficult when you run the car on the dyno. Obviously, you're going to do a ramp run on the dyno, and maybe you've got a little bit of knock occurs at, say, 5,000 RPM. So obviously, you want to remove some timing from 5,000 RPM, get away from that knock. So we know the RPM, but it's a three-dimensional table. And by definition, that default histogram is only logging manifold absolute pressure, which, let's say we're sea level, we're going to be give or take 100 kPa right the way through, which isn't that helpful. How do we go about adding cylinder air mass as a load axis for that histogram so we can actually see what's happening?
So that one is just, you literally just right click on your graph, and then you click your spark advanced side, and you just change that parameter over to still air or cylinder air mass.
So now we're actually going to be able to log a histogram and see whereabouts in the spark tables that ECM was actually operating?
Yes, sir.
Okay. That clarifies one question, but the other one that comes up here is that in the GM controllers, we're going to have a high octane and a low octane spark table. Which one should we be modifying? I know a lot of tuners will set both to be the same, disabling essentially some of the built-in safety elements with it. How should we approach these two tables, and how does the controller actually switch between them or move between them?
Yeah, so this honestly is going to be another personal preference thing. I know some tuners that will actually just, copy over the high octane table to the low octane table. They'll dial it in as a single map and they let it go. I prefer not to do that in most applications unless it's a really high horsepower application. But essentially, high octane is going to be your, like, I always try to think in trucks because I'm a truck kind of guy. So high octane is your single cab short bed truck that's on, really good fuel, and it's not necessarily at MBT, but pretty close to MBT when it comes down to your timing value. Then low octane is going to be your crew cab short bed 4-wheel drive that's got a big trailer behind it on 87 octane. Obviously, it's got so much load that it cannot run that amount of ignition timing. So then you've got a knock learn factor that goes between the two. So that essentially your ECU can adapt to your fuel quality. As long as knock sensors and everything are being true, there's no false knock, headers hitting the frame, anything like that. The ECU can infinitely adapt anywhere between your high octane table and your low octane table values.
Yeah. Okay. So great information there. It's going to expand on a couple of parts of it. Before we do that, though, you use the term MBT. Can you give us a definition of what that is? What does that term mean?
So MBT is essentially the maximum brake torque value that you can get when you're not octane limited. So if you were to put an engine on an engine dyno and you were to dial in your ignition timing, In every cell, whether, obviously our Axie and GM is going to be cylinder air mass versus RPM. If you dial it in, it is the absolute, essentially the maximum power that engine can produce when not octane limited.
Yeah. We often do this in one of our demonstration webinars, and what I do is hold the engine. Our mainline dyno makes this really, really nice and easy. It's a great training tool. Hold the engine at fixed point, say 3,000 RPM and maybe 70 kPa or something. It's got a little load, but not heaps, and under those conditions, that particular engine that I was using will not knock, irrespective of what timing I put into it. And we'll basically do a sweep test where I'll start at maybe 5 degrees of ignition timing, so really severely retarded. And I'll ramp it up in 1 degree increments over the course of about 45 seconds. And you get this nice curve where the torque starts really low with our retarded timing. It comes up quite aggressively. And then as we get near to MBT, it sort of plateaus and we'll find this peak, and that's our MBT timing. So that's the timing that gives us maximum torque. And then if we continue to advance the timing, we actually fall off a cliff on the other side. So that's what we're trying to achieve. Now, obviously, depending on our fuel, we might be knock limited. So we might not be able to get to that MBT value before knock occurs. But what you mentioned as well there is the knock learning. So the ability of the controller to actually move between the high octane spark table or value and the low octane, which is the whole reason that I do not recommend just setting these two tables to be the same. It is there for a reason. I kind of think of it as a bit of a safety backstop. I mean, you go and you tune the engine on the dyno, on the fuel that it's delivered on. You do the best job possible, but you don't know that maybe once it's left your control, maybe it ends up on a batch of really poor grade fuel, and now your high octane spark numbers are too advanced and it's going to cause some knock. Well, the ECU is going to detect that, it's going to learn from that, and it's going to move us towards the low octane. So it's simply engine protection, and anything that's going to protect the engine is something that I'm a massive fan on. That aside, though, the other area where I know a little confusion can creep in is if we've got no knock occurring and we log the ignition timing values during a ramp run on the dyno or maybe on the street, and we compare those to the numbers in our high octane spark table, sometimes they still don't match. And there's a whole bunch of correction factors and multipliers that also are working in the background. So can you give us a little insight into what those are, how important they are, and whether we should be making changes to those tables as well?
Yeah, so GM, whether we're on any of their generations of ECUs, they decided to add some modifiers. And those modifiers are, going to be based off of intake air temp. It's going to be modified off of coolant air tip. It's going to be modified off of if you're in power enrichment or not. And I will tell you that my personal opinion is you do not touch those unless, if you're on a fuel that is different than what they were tuned on. So say you've got we'll say a GM LSA crate motor, Cadillac CTSV. On pump gas, on 93 octane or 98 RON or whatever you guys run on, GM knew what they were doing when they calibrated those IAT tables. There's no sense in touching them. Now, on ethanol or methanol or a fuel that is, better for, or doesn't care as much as intake temp, then that would be where you would modify them. But for the most part, I would never touch the engine coolant temp one. The power enrichment one, that's almost more personal preference, but I try not to touch that one either. But yeah, so I would just say it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. But if you're on the same fuel that the car was running on from the factory and you don't have any type of, new crazy power adder, leave those alone. Let them do their job.
Yeah, I think, again, your tuning methodology absolutely matches mine. I think where you can or may want to make changes to that, as you mentioned there, a really good quality fuel such as E85, where you're unlikely to be knock limited. You may want to reduce some of the power or magnitude of those changes, and that's just going to give you more consistent power as maybe intake air temperature changes. But yeah, I mean, GM have got a lot more resources and a lot more dyno time and calibrator time than we do in the aftermarket. So again, I absolutely agree. Leaving those untouched is almost always the best approach. Now, we have talked a number of times here about knock detection, and knock retard is probably one of the key channels that we're always going to be wanting to monitor in the VCM scanner software. So basically, this is GM's inbuilt way of looking at the piezoelectric knock sensor, basically making sense of the noise profile that sensor is picking up, and deciding whether that noise profile is normal mechanical engine noise or whether it's picked up some detonation or knock, another term, basically two terms for the same type of abnormal combustion. Again, just a real quick rundown for those who maybe don't exactly know what that terminology means. It's a type of abnormal combustion which occurs after the ignition event has already started combustion. And basically, I think most people expect that when the spark occurs, we just get this explosion in the cylinder, all of the fuel and air explodes in one go, job done. That's actually not the case. Normally, we sort of get a flame front that starts at the spark plug and it propagates out through the combustion chamber. As it moves, it ignites the unburned fuel and air ahead of it. While this is happening though, and this is all happening of course very quickly, we get a sharp rise in both pressure and temperature inside the combustion chamber. And in some instances, what this can do is create spontaneous auto-ignition of unburned fuel and air around the outside of the combustion chamber, and this is knock. And when this occurs, it's kind of a little bit like a stick of dynamite exploding in the cylinder, and just as damaging as that might sound. So quick history lesson there for those who haven't heard of that term. Getting back on track though, now we understand what knock is and what the ECU is doing. How effective have you found the GM knock detection strategy? And I'll preface this with, on a lot of vehicles that I tune, I find the knock control strategy of the factory ECU, sometimes it will miss knock that I can audibly hear using knock detection equipment, which is obviously pretty dangerous, or other times it will have false or phantom knock where it's picking up knock that actually isn't occurring. All right, that's a lot of talking about, a lot of background information. Back over to you, Matt. How do you find that particular system in GM's ECUs?
So when it comes to GM knock, it depends on the application. So I will tell you that the later knock sensors, Gen 4, Gen 5, seem to be really good, whereas the earlier style Gen 3, maybe not so much. But when it comes down to knock detection, that is one of the trickiest parts of being a tuner. And there's so many different avenues that you can detect knock, whether it's you pull the spark plug out and you look for the little peppering on the porcelain, whether you just simply watch the tailpipes. Knock will obviously you'll get these big black puffs out the tailpipes. You can use a knock monitor. You can use a number of different things. The dyno, will actually help, tell you if timing is valid or not. But say like a LS3 application, I feel like the knock sensors are pretty good. But say in we'll say like a 2001 2500 HD Silverado, not so much. So it's more application specific, I would guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, that's fair. I think it's probably understandable that as GM's technology advanced with the later models, probably so did their knock detection strategy. I've always been a strong advocate of using audio-based knock detection, so an auxiliary product. My two kind of favorites are the Link knock block and the Plex knock monitor, two really, really capable products at two very different price points with a lot of different functions in the middle there. But basically we're putting an auxiliary knock sensor somewhere on the engine block, and then it's going to some earbuds or a headset, and I'm audibly listening for that very clear ping of knock. That also in and of itself can be tricky on some vehicles, particularly when you start moving to solid lifters, etc., mechanical cam. There's a lot more mechanical noise going on in the engine, so deciphering knock can get a little bit trickier. It's a bit of an art as well as a science, but generally I always advocate using that initially to basically validate that the built-in knock control strategy is working. Once we kind of know, hey, yep, I've ticked that box, it's picking up the knock that I can hear, it's not picking up knock that I can't hear, I can trust that we're good to go, because, putting audio knock detection equipment on every engine that you tune can be a very time consuming job. Even just finding a worthwhile, empty thread on the block that you can use is quite tricky. So it's nice when you can say to yourself, well, look, I've now tuned 50 or 100 Gen 4 LS vehicles, and I just know that the knock control works. So now I can actually just rely on using that in the scanner. The next obvious question is, what level of knock do you find is acceptable? And again, I'll preface this with, it's quite scary if you look at the knock retard sort of feedback on an absolute 100% showroom stock vehicle, even running on the best grade of fuel available, let's say 93 in the US. There's a lot of knock activity going on, correct?
There is. And that is one thing that it plagues so many tuners, where their customers actually have access to be able to look at the knock retard value, especially in the Mustang world. When it comes to knock, it just comes down to experience of, is this an engine that I've tuned a lot? Have I had it with, have I tuned this engine before on good fuel? Have I tuned it in with this camshaft? And so it comes down to personal experience with me. So say I'm tuning on like a 6th gen ZL1, and we are at stock boost levels. It may have just a basic cold air, maybe some, long tube headers, something like that. I'm going to leave those ignition values alone. We haven't done anything that really alters cylinder pressure. So let's just leave it alone and let the high octane and low octane table do its job. And so, that's one downside about producing videos where people can, see, my graphs, simultaneously on the video is, they're going to look at it as, oh, well, you had some knock there, but, I'll have a camera facing the tailpipe and just kind of go over and explain to them, hey, that's how this algorithm works. You have to be able to adapt down.
Yeah. I think my approach there is actually a little bit different, which is absolutely fine. Again, I think it comes back down to what I said earlier. There's no black and white here. A lot of this is a personal approach. I mean, one of the things I see when maybe the first LS2 I ever tuned, which was pretty stock, came in, I put it on the dyno, and straight away you're already seeing some knock activity. And I'm sort of thinking to myself, well, yeah, okay, it's already a little richer than I'd normally operate, and it's knocking. So where the hell am I going to find some more power? An interesting aspect is I find with those vehicles, retarding the high octane table to a point where I've reduced that knock retard activity during a ramp run, or maybe got rid of it altogether, will actually show more power. Now, that doesn't on face value make any sense, so let me explain. When we get a knock retard event, let's say we might only just be encountering some very light knock, and maybe just pulling a degree of timing would be sufficient to prevent that. But the engine control module will generally pull more timing than is required. Maybe it'll pull 3 degrees. And then there is a rate at which that timing is then ramped back in if no more knock is occurring. So we might have that 3 degrees pulled for a second of the ramp run. This is really splitting hairs here. But if we can get a run where the knock retard doesn't have to come in at all, we're going to have more average timing, and we're going to show a gain in power. Now, granted, the gain's probably going to be small. It'll be a few horsepower. We're not picking up 20 here. But that's sort of been my approach. And obviously, it differs from yours, but that's also fine. What I'm trying to do when I'm tuning a more modified vehicle with the knock retard is I'm not going to be too worried under the cruise or light load conditions if there's a little bit of knock here and there, as long as it's not repeatable. Where I'm obviously most worried about it is under power enrichment, wide open throttle conditions where the engine is actually under significant load, because that is where knock is going to do more damage and quicker. But even then, it's quite possible and probable that we will see an occasional knock event occur. And I'm okay with that as long as it isn't what I call repeatable. So what I mean is, if I go out and do a full power ramp acceleration run on the road, and I get one hit of knock at 5,000 RPM in third gear at sort of wide open throttle, okay, that's one hit of knock. Let's go and do that again. Did it happen again? If it happens in exactly the same point again, well, all right, now I'm going to go and address that table. But quite often what we'll find is that might have been a result of some heat soak or something of that nature. And once we've actually got rid of that heat soak, we're back down to normal operating temperatures, that knock goes away. What I'm getting at is if we try and tune the ignition tables to a point where we never see any activity from the knock retard in the scanner, we're going to end up with an overly conservative tune where we're actually leaving significant amounts of power and torque on the table. Now, again, that's just my experience. I'm interested, how does that match your reality?
Yes, you're exactly right. Now, the only reason why certain applications I'm okay with some knock is traditionally if it's on a platform that I've tuned a whole bunch of. If I've tuned, say, 5th gen Camaros with a specific like a GPI SS3 or a BTR Stage 3 camshaft, I've tuned so many of those that there's a lot of these vehicles where I can tell, okay, this has got to be fuel quality, and I don't want to have them down on power if they go get a better batch of fuel. So I'm okay with the knock events because that's how GM, they left the showroom floor with knock events.
Yes, yeah. And again, I think it's just like our discussion about the short-term and long-term fuel trims. It's about understanding what GM felt was acceptable and not trying too hard to, let's say, outdo GM with our own tuning.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so moving a little bit out of order, probably should have talked about this when we were talking about our MAF and speed density calibration. I want to talk about MAF-less tuning. And I think this is an area in the GM world where there's a lot of controversy about when and if you should perform a MAF-less tune. As the name implies, we are removing the mass airflow sensor out of the system and then relying solely on that speed density subsystem. Now, personally, I found with the Gen 3 LS1 that removing the mass airflow sensor on that particular vehicle actually showed a gain in power, whereas Gen 4 onwards, I saw nothing. So I think a lot of people assume that mass airflow sensor is an airflow restriction, and therefore getting rid of that and doing nothing else in and of itself is going to gain us some power. Is that the case in your experience?
I honestly found the opposite. So to me, the Gen 3 ECU always made just a couple numbers more on the dyno with the MAF enabled. And I don't know if it was just because it's easier for the ECU to process, but that's what I'd found. Now, when it comes to Gen 4 and Gen 5, I haven't really seen a difference whatsoever.
Yeah, okay. No, well, obviously, results may differ. What is the case study then, in your opinion, for a MAF-less tune? Is there ever a reason where we should be performing a MAF-less tune?
Absolutely. So it all comes down to your specific vehicle application. So if you have a airflow path or an intake, whether it's turbocharged, whether it's naturally aspirated, if you have an event to where the MAF is turbulent, I absolutely agree with getting rid of it. A lot of the Pontiac G8s or y'all's Holden Commodore, I guess is what y'all call it. They'll do the over the radiator intake. And those things are notorious for having turbulence around the MAF. Or if you've got a pro-charged or turbocharged vehicle, anytime that MAF is really turbulent, you get, obviously, if it's giving the ECU a bad input, the ECU is outputting a horrible injector pulse width or fuel calculation, and it disrupts everything: idle quality, drivability, everything. So there are specific applications where I will personally go speed density 100% of the time.
Yeah. The Holden Commodore, which you just mentioned, Pontiac G8 with the over-the-radiator intake, is a really, really good example. So I'm glad you brought that up. And anyone who's tuned one of these on a dyno with a big old fan out in front of the car, which obviously all dynos have, you can see this so clearly. Have the thing sitting there idle, look at your fuel trims, turn the fan on, and watch what happens to those fuel trims in real time, because that turbulent nature of the airflow from the fan just absolutely plays havoc with the mass airflow sensor, which obviously makes you question then what's actually happening with the airflow out on the road at speed, but that's probably a discussion for another day. On that note, what is your sort of preference when it comes to tuning options for a really aggressive cam?
So camshaft, I honestly still prefer to leave it on MAF.
Okay.
It comes down to, I personally don't have issues if VVE or VE is dialed in and the MAF is dialed in. As long as the MAF has a clean signal, leave it alone. Now, the guys that would descreen the MAFs drove me insane. I prefer that honeycomb to be there.
It's there for a reason, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think, again, this comes down to this misconception that anything in the airflow path is a restriction. I mean, I guess this comes from a place of what appears to be common sense, but it's not everything is always what it seems. And those screens are there for a reason. It's really important to have clean, non-turbulent airflow through the mass airflow sensor. And by removing those screens, we get, not that.
Yeah, exactly.
Since I've mentioned cams, I think this is, at least in my experience, both from tuning engines with large cams as well as seeing the mess that most tuners make of them, this is the area that causes the most problems. Where do you think tuners are mainly going wrong tuning these LS engines for an aggressive cam?
I honestly think it comes down to tuners that just aren't paying attention to what the camshaft is doing to the engine itself. With a large camshaft, it is obvious that is going to reduce volumetric efficiency down low. It is going to add to volumetric efficiency at higher RPM, and the tuners are completely just ignoring that. And I don't understand it, honestly. To me, it's you tune the vehicle for the modifications that are there, and to me, those are self-explanatory. But that's just from years of experience.
I mean, I think to me it does make sense that people are getting this so wrong. And the simple reason is that they do not have a fundamental understanding of how the engine operates, and flowing on from that, what changing a camshaft is going to do to the volumetric efficiency of the engine, as you just mentioned. And it's clear if you only need to look at a torque and power graph comparison of a stock engine versus one with a cam, and you're going to see there's no free lunches here. Yes, we're going to pick up hopefully a good chunk of power and torque at higher RPM, and in order to do that, we're going to be giving away something down at the bottom end. So obviously the VE drops at the bottom end and increases at the top end, just like you said. I think maybe the main problem I see is actually around idle control with a big cam. It's so common to have an engine that won't start up properly, will stall when you're selecting gears, trying to pull away from a stop sign, etc. What needs to be addressed in order to correct those problems?
When it comes down to it, you just got to start with what you know. So, if pretty much any cam manufacturer will give you somewhat of an idea as to where it should idle. At least, I don't know if y'all's cams are the same way, but if you were to pull up like a Gwatney Performance camshaft, it's going to tell you it idles stable at say 700 or 750. So the first thing to do is going to be to figure out the RPM where you develop that good, strong idle quality that has good manifold vacuum for your brakes to operate. And then instead of going in and starting to change everything, just go drive the car. If we've got an increase in idle RPM, we know we're going to need some type of, base airflow that needs to be also raised. The cool part is with that mass airflow sensor, it'll kind of give you an idea of, okay, if dynamic air is at 10 grams per second of airflow, then we know that's essentially what the engine needs to idle. We can use the mass airflow sensor and the dynamic air in our VVE table to help us along with idle tuning.
Yeah, great points. Let's dive into them individually. Nice that your cam manufacturers are actually listing a target idle speed, because they're a New Zealand company, and I've also been using their product with great success for 20 plus years. I tend to favour the Calford product. They don't do that, which would be a real nice addition, because I reckon that's the first place people get this wrong. Let's take a stock LS2, LS3, it's probably going to happily idle at, let's say, 550 RPM.
Right, yeah, 550 to 600.
Yeah. And it's going to be pretty happy there and pretty smooth. Try getting a decent cam with, a lot of duration and overlap to idle at that. You are going to have a bad time, and you're just never going to get there. So, of course, you're going to have problems. I think that's the first key, is choosing a realistic idle speed that's actually going to be achievable with a particular cam you've got. I'll just give a little anecdote here. So years and years ago, I was involved with a tin top racing series here in New Zealand, and it was all V8 based, and there were a range of different engines. One was actually an LS3, there was a Ford Coyote, and the one that was of interest here is TRD built Grand Am 5-litre V8. So this is based on the, 3UZFE. And this was TRD built for the Grand Am series, so it's an OE race-built engine, and we had no real informational specs on it. So I wired this thing up, got it running, and it was super aggressive. It was making, I think, 560, 580 horsepower, and I could not get the thing to idle. Now, I'm sort of coming from a background of, a large capacity V8 should easily be able to operate at sort of 6, maybe 700 RPM. Yes, this thing's got some big aftermarket cams. Let's be super generous and give it a 1200 RPM idle speed. And absolutely not. I just chased my tail for hours on this thing. And in the end, the only way I could get this to idle was with a target of about 1650, which is just out the gate. I mean, my drag engine was idling at sort of those sort of RPMs. And anyway, I mean, that's what it was. That's all I could do with it. Sounded great, did the job, sent it out the door. And when the guys that I was dealing with came back to me, they're like, oh, we've actually got this manual from TRD about this engine. Quoted target idle speed, 1800 RPM. I mean, that would have been great information to have at the outset.
Well, the best thing to do is when you're tuning is give it what it wants and develop a theory later. And so when it comes to target idle, I've gotten to the point now where just with experience, I can look at the intake duration of the camshaft and have an idea of, okay, this camshaft's going to want 800 or 900 or 1000. It's just, that's what you got to figure out first. That is step number one, is get the thing to idle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, obviously a lot of that does unfortunately come with experience, but you will quickly build up a bit of an idea of whether the engine is happy at a particular RPM. Where this gets a little bit trickier as well is if you're running an auto with a stock converter instead of a high stall, you're starting to walk this tightrope between getting an idle speed where the cam and the engine are happy, but also the thing's not pushing, so you've got to stand on the brakes every time you come to a stop. But that's probably a little outside our actual tuning. Now, the other point you just made is this base running airflow. So again, I think the base running airflow tables are ones that a lot of tuners new to GM don't understand or don't know exist. So this is essentially the airflow required at idle, which is going to drive the idle control circuit or drive-by-wire throttle opening. And again, as you mentioned there, you've got your airflow, your dynamic airflow numbers. So you can actually use these in a histogram to log into the base running airflow tables, because it will have these for, relative to engine temperature. So again, we can actually develop these tables using a histogram, correct?
Yes, sir. Yeah, now it comes down to obviously which generation of ECU you're running. Gen 3, you had short-term idle trims, long-term idle trims. So it's kind of more like our field trims that we had discussed. It would give you, the ECU is basically telling us how far off it is. And in certain operating systems on the Gen 4, Gen 5 stuff, it will kind of also give you an idea of either what it's doing to base spark advance or if it's actually using its PID to adjust the airflow. But it is Gen 4 is... It's where it starts to get tricky for idle control, because it does rely so heavily on adaptives and the torque model and things like that. That's where GM's starting to make that transition over to numbers that aren't actually in full control.
Sure. Okay. So we've talked about the idle tuning. We've talked about getting our MAF calibration and our VE tables dialed in to suit the changes that we know a cam is going to make. Are there any other obvious common mistakes you see time and time again?
Ignition timing, for sure, when it comes to idle control. Guys not allowing the ECU to control, because the ECU, obviously what it does is not only is it using the throttle body or throttle blade to add airflow, it's also adding or subtracting ignition timing. And so your high octane and low octane table at the idle values is essentially a cap of how much ignition in advance you can actually run. So if you've got the thing idling at, say, 22 degrees of ignition advance and your high octane table is at 25, you're only allowing that ECU up to move up 3 degrees if necessary. So ignition timing is another thing that a lot of guys get wrong when it comes to idle tuning.
Yeah, I think the way I kind of explain that is that the ECU is using the throttle blade position, I'm assuming obviously drive-by-wire, as a course adjustment for idle speed. But that's sort of, there's a little latency in that taking effect, whereas advancing or retarding the ignition timing, that can be a very sharp, snappy way of increasing or decreasing the idle speed. So the two kind of go hand in hand together, but that idle ignition control is absolutely critical to getting good control of your idle speed. Now, I think the last topic we'll cover today is injector upgrades, because this is another area, and it's not limited to GM, but if we're talking aftermarket standalone world, you can pick up a set of eBay injectors with absolutely no information on them, put them in your engine, and I mean, it's not going to be pretty, it's not going to be perfect, but you can get that engine up and running without too much trouble. Things are a little bit more complex in the OE world, particularly as these controllers get more advanced. So can you explain what is required with the GM world in terms of an injector upgrade?
Yeah, absolutely. So injector upgrade, your injector data is the most critical value that you can input to that ECU. Before you even work on MAF calibration or speed density or anything, injector data has to be there. It has to be accurate. And so if you're purchasing a set of injectors where you don't have good data, you could run them if you want to send them off to a company like Dishworks or somebody that can actually do injector characterization tests. But overall, from a financial standpoint, just go ahead on and buy a decent set of injectors that have quality injector data. And because if you feed your ECU garbage, it's going to output garbage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is probably one of the areas where injector dynamics kind of changed the game for the aftermarket tuning world, in that, at least to the best of my knowledge, they were one of, if not the first, to actually start understanding how the injector operates. And then once controllers like GM came out, then actually providing us in the aftermarket with plug and play data that you can literally just copy and paste out of an Excel spreadsheet and drop straight into the relevant tables. So, I mean, most people, when they think of injectors, they're thinking of the flow rate being the key characteristic or metric for the injector. And yeah, obviously that's pretty important, but it goes a little further than that. And in the GM world, we've got injector flow versus KPA. So these are a deadhead fuel system. So our fuel pressure is fixed. So the actual injector flow is going to depend on the manifold pressure, because that's then defining the differential pressure across the injector. So that's our flow rate. So that is relatively straightforward, but subtle aspects that also have a big effect is the offset table. So that's often called battery compensation or dead time, essentially just defining that the fact that the amount of time that it takes for the injector to open and to a lesser extent close will depend on the battery voltage available. And then finally, GM also go one step further and include a short pulse width at a table, which kind of fixes the non-linear area. And I'm not going to get into that in too much detail. I need another podcast to explain it, down in the sort of lower operating areas. So, yeah, it's quite a complex model of characterizing that injector. And the whole key to this is knowing that what I was talking about earlier in this podcast, where if the ECU knows accurately the mass of air entering the engine, then it knows what mass of fuel it needs to deliver in order to get to a specific air-fuel ratio. And the more accurately the injector's operation is characterized, the better job it can do of getting there. Long story short here, if you're going to do a set of injectors in basically any factory ECU, I would argue, you want to be buying injectors with that correct data. Yeah, you might be spending a little bit more money at the outset, but it's going to save you pulling your hair out, and you're going to end up with a better result. And yeah, at least my experience is often when you've got the data, you put these bigger injectors in, you might be doubling the injector size, put all that data in and no other changes, you can start the engine up and it's going to start and idle almost essentially like stock with the same fuel trims. Does that sort of match your experience?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
So it just makes the tuner's job so much easier. So don't try cheaping out with your eBay special injectors or some unknown quantity injector. It is absolutely going to bite you. All right, Matt, I think we'll move towards wrapping this up, and we're going to finish off with the same 3 questions we ask all of our guests. And the first of those is, what's next in the future for you?
Honestly, I went from being an unknown person that was just kind of minding my own business to this person where I'm putting out tuning information. I'm helping big YouTubers, with their tuning projects. And it sounds like I'm just going to be doing a lot more of that, a lot more tuning on YouTube, a lot more tuning of vehicles for like Cletus McFarland or some of the bigger YouTubers. I'm going to be doing a lot more of that, and probably a little bit less physical dyno work and more so onto the remote tuning side of things.
All right, so a couple of aspects that are worth digging into on this. First of all, the remote tuning side of things. I think this has a checkered reputation. And I mean, this really comes down to partly the complexity of the vehicle we're tuning, and really this is the data that we can get from the scanner to see what's going on, or data logger, but also, of course, the quality of the tuner making these changes. For you, is remote tuning more difficult or challenging than having the vehicle in front of you on a dyno?
Absolutely. I would say as a tuner, I feel like you need to be tuning for, I'm going to say 10 to 15 years before you should even consider remote tuning. What the common misconception is people think that as tuners that our main job is the tuning part, and it's not. It's diagnostics. We're diagnostics number one. And so until you've tuned enough of a platform that you specialize in to be able to understand, okay, I've got this MAF calibration, this VE table in the vehicle, and my fuel trims are off 30%. What's going on? Do they have it on ethanol and I don't know about it? Do they have a vacuum leak? So once you kind of get that up and going, I actually personally find that remote tuning does a better job of tuning. And the only reason why I say that is because the customer is not in a rush. They can drive the vehicle on the way to work. They can get me a 45-minute data log. Well, obviously, if we're using fuel trims, 45 minutes of data is better than 6 minutes of data. So, and we can just continue to go. So whenever it comes to my personal remote tuning, I don't stop until the job is 100% done. So some of the remote tuners will say, hey, you get 5 revisions or 10 revisions. I've got customers where we've done 30 revisions over 2 months' time. But that vehicle is so perfect that when you look at a data log, it makes me smile because it looks so good.
I think that's the sort of satisfaction from a job well done that, again, as you earlier mentioned, separates the men from the boys, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely.
I do recall one of the weird aspects of not maybe tuning remotely just via data logs, but I had a customer was a bit of a hangover from my previous business in Germany, and he had a Volkswagen Golf VR6 engine, I think it was. I think from memory it was sort of 1,100 wheel horsepower. So the thing was no joke. It was small capacity, so I was using a fair bit of boost to do this. And I'd sort of be up late at night logging in using TeamViewer, and I'm accessing the tuning software, and you're just watching this cursor trace this path through this fuel table. And it's just the weirdest scenario, the weirdest experience, because you're not hearing what it's doing. I mean, this thing would be absolutely roaring, making 1,000 horsepower. It's just dead silent. And I found that's one of the tricky parts, because it sounds weird, but as a tuner, you kind of develop a bit of a sixth sense on everything that is going on around you when you're on the dyno. So what I'm talking about is the sound that the engine's making, the exhaust note, vibrations, all of those things can be subtle little elements that just give you a sixth sense of like, this thing is absolutely on point, it's sharp, it's crisp, I know that the tune is where it needs to be, or, something's just not right here. And unfortunately, that is one of those senses that gets removed from you when you are tuning remotely. But, that's the limitation of doing it, so no real way around that. The work that you're doing as well for these big YouTubers, you mentioned Cletus McFarlane there, do you find that kind of drives more customers through the door, or is there no real correlation there?
No, it definitely drives more customers through the door. Honestly, my personal YouTube channel where I'm teaching has brought the most work in. And the Cletus McFarlane guys, it comes down to they see us do crazy stuff on video, and then they want to do that same crazy stuff with their personal cars, and they don't realize that, we've got a whole team of guys that are top fabricators, top wiring guys that are actually handling these vehicles to where even though it may look like we're doing crazy stuff, they're only catching the fun parts. And so when it comes down to my remote tuning stuff, it comes down to I've specialized in LS, LT based vehicles, and I traditionally tune trucks. So, it's most of the time it's just guys that's got a cammed truck that maybe has a Pro Charger or something on there. So I do so many of the same vehicle. It's kind of like Lund Racing with the Coyote platform. It comes down to that. So if somebody were to call me with a 2000 Camaro that's turbo 400 with twin turbos, I would not remote tune that. I'm going to be very specific as to what I actually remote tune.
I think that's a really important point you've just made there. Sticking to your lane and not trying to be all things to all people. And because, as you've already mentioned, when you've got experience with a given combination, it's straight away going to stick out. When there's an anomaly there, that's going to stand out. There's going to be a huge red flag for you, which on a platform that you've got limited experience with might not be so straightforward. Let's move on. Our next question, is there any advice you give to a younger version of yourself or maybe to one of our listeners to help reach where you are today in your career faster or potentially overcome some pitfalls that you may have come across during your time?
So first thing I would always recommend to everybody is don't ever get to a point where you don't listen to somebody else's advice. If you've got somebody that you look up to or somebody that you can ask questions, always listen to their answers. They may not even be providing you with the best advice, but hearing others' opinions, you'd be surprised at what you can learn. So that was one of the biggest things with, like, in my earlier years of tuning was back then I had such an ego because it come down to, oh, well, I made more power on the dyno than this person. And then as you progress, you start to learn that these experienced guys, it's not that they can't make that power, it's that they choose not to. And so that's where I would start off, is just by asking questions and try to ask from guys that don't mind giving you an answer. If you've got a tuner that makes you believe that this is pure wizardry and they don't want to teach you, chances are they probably don't actually know what they're doing.
Yeah, again, could not agree more. And this has come up numerous times on the podcast, and your experience echoes my own journey learning how to tune. You start with a little bit of success and think you're some guru and you've got some magic wand that no one else has got access to. And then as you progress, it's that Dunning-Kruger effect of, you don't know what you don't know. And the more you start to learn, the more you start questioning everything that you already think. And yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you may want to actually choose to not make the absolute and maximum amount of power and torque that an engine can produce, and for good reason. So I think being humble and always open to the experience of those that may actually know more than you, that's going to stand you in really good stead for your career. All right, Matt, last question for today. If people want to follow you and see what you're up to, how are they best to do so? What's your website, your social media accounts?
So social media accounts is always my name. It's Matt Sanford. When it comes to the website stuff, I actually have a couple different names, but the primary name is tuning-tips.com. But YouTube is where most people find me, and that's just, again, it's my name. It's Matt Sanford.
Okay, great. Well, as usual, we'll put those links into the show notes to make it easy for people to find. And obviously, in researching this particular episode, I did spend a fair bit of time stalking your YouTube channel, and hats off to you putting out some really great information. And for those who want to get into the GM tuning world, you could do a lot worse than spending some time on Matt's YouTube channel and absorbing all of that information.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Look, thank you for your time today, Matt. Really appreciated the chat. It's always great to nerd out over some deep dive details on a particular platform, which we don't always get to do. So I apologize to the Ford and Dodge and Honda, Toyota, essentially every other platform. But for those who are in the GM world, hopefully this episode has been of some use. Thanks again for your time.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of Tuned In with Matt Sanford, we'd love it if you could drop a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that in turn helps us to continue to get more high quality guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt free of charge anywhere in the world. This is also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to Big Ted joining us from New Zealand. Ted has said awesome motorsport content. Having been a follower of High Performance Academy for some time and purchaser of more than a couple of courses, maybe 10 plus, the podcasts have reiterated the learning from the online courses. The quality of guests and depth of information provided is next level. Well, thanks for the kind words, Big Ted, and if you get in touch with your t-shirt size and shipping details, we'll get a fresh tee shipped straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now, remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.